The Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact will come to order. Good morning, everyone, or actually good afternoon now. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for a hearing entitled Implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act and Investing in Early Childhood Education and Development. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the document to the previously mentioned address or contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the Chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate any background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. We're gathered today to discuss the implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act and the importance of early childhood development policy. The Global Child Thrive Act, or better known as GCTA, directs the USAID to implement and prioritize early childhood development programs for children marginalized by poverty and conflict. Back in October of 2019, I introduced this legislation with Representative Fitzpatrick, the Republican lead here in the House, and Senators Blunt and Coons in the Senate. Within a single Congress, we were able to get the bill signed into law as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. It's not every day that a bill becomes law, especially so rapidly. This achievement was made possible thanks to the leadership of my fellow members of Congress and the incredible advocacy of Catholic Relief Services and the entire Thrive Coalition. Since the bill's passage, we've been engaged with the administration on their plans to implement the bill and have engaged with stakeholders who have an important role to play in guiding the administration's actions. We also recently partnered with the Thrive Coalition and others to secure an increase of $5 million for the Global Health Programs Account for vulnerable children in the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill, reinforcing Chairwoman Barbara Lee's longstanding commitment to vulnerable children. Now comes the hard part, ensuring the Global Child Thrive Act's successful implementation, which is why I wanted to call this hearing today. Our work to help vulnerable children and advance early childhood development is far from over. Like all crises, COVID-19 has hit those who are already vulnerable the hardest, especially in the global South and those living at the margins of society. Over 250 million children are at risk of impaired development due to the impacts of poverty, poor nutrition, and inadequate learning, threatening children's ability to thrive and countries' future success. Global poverty has risen for the first time in decades. Economies around the world have stalled, inequality has risen, and societies have fractured along familiar lines. For children around the world, the disruptive impacts of this pandemic on early childhood development and education threaten to undo decades of hard work and progress. In particular, the pandemic devastated education programs around the world. According to some estimates, 90% of schools around the world closed their doors during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a temporary measure to stop the spread of COVID, but there's a real concern that it could become permanent for some students. For example, the United Nations has estimated that 11 million girls will not return to school after the pandemic, and some organizations estimate it could be as high as 20 million. And we can't let that happen. I commend USAID for their early work on implementation, but I call on them to speed up their efforts and to ensure that all aspects of the law are fully adopted. Implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act will require action not just from USAID, but from other federal agencies as well, including those who are primarily focused on domestic policy priorities. One priority of mine is to ensure that these agencies understand their responsibilities and act. I also swiftly believe that the administration must move quickly. I also believe the administration must move swiftly to appoint a permanent special advisor for assistance to orphans and vulnerable children, as the bill envisions, and strengthens its outreach efforts to stakeholders such as the members of the Thrive Coalition. I also believe we must take a fresh look at whether current strategies, like the Advancing Protection and Care for Children in Adversity, which runs from 2019 to 2023, should be reassessed ahead of schedule, given the impacts of COVID-19 and the requirements of the GCTA. And I don't need to preach to y'all on how early childhood education produces one of the highest returns on investment and is one of the most effective tools to advance smarter, healthier, and fairer places around the world. Recent reports have estimated that over 1 million children have lost a parent or caregiver to the COVID-19 pandemic. There simply is not a more pivotal time than now to strengthen U.S. leadership in early childhood development. I will continue to work hard to ensure that the United States humanitarian assistance and the international development programs are supported, funded, and made more effective for a post-COVID world. And that starts with an effective implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses and, of course, listening to the discussion in the Q&A portion of our hearing. With that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member of the subcommittee for her statement.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, for holding this hearing on the implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act and the importance of early childhood development. We know that key investments at early stages of a child's life makes a difference in a child's long-term health, well-being, and development, and ultimately leading to a healthier and more productive economies around the world. At a time when over 35 million children are forcibly displaced from their homes and COVID-19 continues to erase progress toward eradicating extreme poverty, these investments are all the more critical. The Bipartisan Global Child Thrive Act of 2020, signed into law in January 2021, seeks to elevate efforts to reduce child mortality rates and integrate early childhood development programs into existing foreign aid programs. And there's also independent organizations like Catholic Relief Services, which is currently implementing early childhood development programs in over 20 countries and reaching almost 2 million children, all predominantly funded by private donations from the faith community. We should encourage that private support for this cause. Much of our taxpayer-funded foreign aid, on the other hand, goes to places like Venezuela, where U.S. aid has provided over $1.4 billion in assistance since 2017. Until the 1980s, Venezuela was by far the wealthiest and most developed country in South America. So why are we even talking about humanitarian aid to a country that was once the 4th wealthiest in the world per capita just a few decades ago? The answer is socialism. Socialist dictators Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro turned Venezuela into a wasteland of poverty, corruption, and state violence. They fed their students the same kind of socialist propaganda that so many on the left want in our own schools today. Parents in my district and across the country are worried sick about the indoctrination of students in public schools. They are concerned that ahistorical and divisive critical race theory is being taught by our teachers, all funded by taxpayer dollars. This simply cannot stand. While we should continue to promote freedom, free markets, and healthy education systems overseas, that work must also begin right here in the United States. I look forward to hearing from both of our witnesses to hear some real-world examples of how integration of early childhood development into ongoing foreign aid programs is demonstrating success overseas. We must understand whether these programs are achieving their objectives and apply our lessons learned to other programs at home and around the globe. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'll now introduce our distinguished witnesses. Our witnesses for today's hearing are first Ms. Marianne Menjivar, who is the Country Director in Venezuela and Colombia for the International Rescue Committee, where she's the Director for Venezuela Response, and our second witness, Ms. Leila Nimatallah, who is the Senior Policy and Legislative Specialist at Catholic Relief Services and one of the key drivers of the Thrive Coalition. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. I'll first call on Ms. Menjivar for her testimony. Ms. Menjivar, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Castro and Ranking Member Malitakis, for convening this hearing today on the crisis facing young children in humanitarian and development settings. My name is Marianne Menjivar, and I'm the Director for the Venezuela response at the International Rescue Committee. Your leadership on early childhood development is both admirable and critical to addressing both present and future threats to the health, well-being, and prosperity of children, their families, and whole societies. The IRC's mission is to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their future. We work in approximately 40 countries affected by conflict and crisis around the world, meeting the needs of our youngest clients by addressing all the components of early childhood development. That is, providing access to good health, balanced nutrition, early learning, safety, and loving and nurturing caregiving. The need that we see is dire. The early years is a time of the most rapid brain development. 1 million neural connections are formed every second, leading to 90% of the brain being developed by the age of 5. As the duration of conflicts and displacement continues to rise, 71 million children under the age of 5 have lived in conflict areas for their entire lifetimes. This means that children are spending their whole childhoods without access to the foundations for healthy human development. The COVID pandemic has only worsened this situation for young children today. But there is hope if we act with decision and urgency. Children are resilient, and with the right support, they can recover and fulfill their potential. The United States government has long been a generous and influential partner in ensuring the health, the education, and safety of children. With the right commitment to implementing and funding programs and research to further build the evidence on what works, the United States has the potential to be an even greater leader in this well-being. I oversee IRC's programs in Colombia, in Ecuador, and Venezuela, where we provide support to families, to parents, and children affected by the largest displacement in the Americas today. To give you an example, in Colombia, the IRC supports migrant families on the move. They're known as walkers, as they walk across Colombia, seeking their new place where to rebuild their lives. And we provide access to child play areas along the road en route, supplying families with traveling play kits, and teaching parents how to connect and stimulate their children whilst on the move. We do this for 22,000 families. I want to share with you what it is that mothers who are carrying babies as they walk hundreds and hundreds of kilometers tell me when I ask them, why are you undertaking this perilous journey? And they say, I can no longer feed my children. I can no longer watch them go hungry to bed at night. I cannot stand not being able to provide food for my kids. They want their children to have access to healthcare and medicines when they need them. They want their babies and young children to have regular meals. They need to provide a safe roof and a safe environment for the young families away from violence, from gangs, from social unrest, from economic meltdown. They understand that if they don't provide these things for children when they're young, that the chance of accessing safe learning environments for these children, it will mean that their children will become part of a social problem later on in life. At the IRC, we know that spending on early childhood development projects is a good investment and the most cost-efficient way to create healthy adults and to prevent violence in our societies in the future. The Global Child Thrive Act offers a blueprint for US foreign assistance by strengthening coordination and evaluation of early childhood development investments across humanitarian and development programs. But this is just a first step. For its full realization, we need leadership within the administration to urgently appoint a special advisor, to push for rapid implementation and financing of early childhood development programs like the one I just mentioned, and to generate focused oversight from Congress. Funding should be increased across all of the accounts that meet the needs of young children. Future US investments for ECD should also include funding research as part of programs so we can learn what works, for whom, under what conditions, and at what cost. I offer my sincere thanks to the subcommittee for its commitment to early childhood development in fragile and crisis-affected settings, and for giving me the opportunity to share the challenges facing IOC's youngest clients and the solutions we know are possible. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your testimony. And I'll now call on Ms. Nimatallah for her testimony. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Maliatakis, and other subcommittee members for holding this important hearing today. Again, my name is Leila Nimatallah. I am Senior Policy and Legislative Specialist for Catholic Relief Services, and I'm going to share with the committee the way that CRS implements early childhood development programs, why we invested at all levels of the agency in ECD, and our recommendations to Congress and the administration going forward. Integrating early childhood development into child, family, community, and governmental programs is not only cost-effective, but an important part of CRS's mission to promote the right of all people to lead full and productive lives, meeting their basic physical needs, and living within strong families in an atmosphere of peace, justice, and human dignity. Within families, interventions include modeling and coaching of hygiene and health practices, breastfeeding and age-appropriate nutrition, psychosocial stimulation, talking and singing to infants and young children, providing opportunities to play, and alternatives to harsh discipline practices. Caregivers receive ongoing mentoring as well as monitoring and referral for child development concerns. With technical support from CRS and funding from Catholics around the United States and the Hilton Foundation, Catholic Sisters and the community health volunteers empower caregivers, both men and women, with skills on early childhood development and instill in them the understanding that parents and caregivers play the most critical role in the overall development of children under their care. In fact, we found ECD to be so transformative and successful in building child brain architecture and breaking the cycle of poverty that we partnered up with Catholics around the US and others of good faith and leaders in Congress and other global child advocates who all, as we've said, make up what we now call the Thrive Coalition, to educate and raise awareness about the importance of the US government investing in and integrating ECD into our foreign assistance programming. During the previous Congress, it was really thanks to leaders like Chairman Castro and many other members and staffers who spearheaded and supported the Global Child Thrive Act along the way during a very difficult year. It's because of them that the world's most vulnerable children were prioritized. And we thank you, we congratulate you for that, and appreciate your continued efforts to expand funding for these children and oversee the proper implementation of the Global Child Thrive Act. Previous to the passage of the GCTA, our US foreign assistance structure invested little in ECD, meaning that the US was not maximizing its foreign assistance or ensuring that children were doing more than just surviving past their fifth birthday. We understand that it will take significant amount of work to integrate ECD across sectors as mandated by the GCTA, and we appreciate the administration's efforts thus far to take this challenge on. Going forward, we offer the following recommendations to Congress and the administration for consideration, many of which have been listed today. Number one, appoint a special advisor for children in adversity to head up the office tasked with overseeing the implementation of the law. While the acting special advisor is doing an excellent job, she is not fully empowered in this role the way she would be if she were formally appointed. Number two, expand funding for vulnerable children, not only within the vulnerable children line item, but also across all sectors that support these children and their families. And we thank you, Chairman Castro. We thank Representative Fitzpatrick and others for their efforts to do this. We also want to acknowledge State Foreign Operations Chair Lee for expanding a number of these critical accounts in her mark for FY22. We urge the Senate appropriators in this direction as well. Number three, encourage other donors, partner countries, and multilaterals to integrate and invest in ECD and other programs supporting vulnerable children. In closing, I wish to again thank Chairman Castro and Ranking Member Malliotakis and the committee staff, because it's because of you and your efforts to pass the Global Child Thrive Act and ensure its successful implementation that millions of the world's most vulnerable children will now have a chance to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you both for your testimony and for your hard work. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and the minority. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we'll be sure to circle back to you. And if you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. So I'll start by recognizing myself. The most recent strategy that governs USAID's actions is the Advancing Protection and Care for Children in Adversity, which runs from 2019 to 2023. And given the widespread impact of COVID-19 across the world, how does this current strategy hold up? And should it be updated before it expires to include the Global Child Thrive Act's priorities and COVID-19 impacts? And I would address that to either of our witnesses there.
So perhaps I could begin, and I'll let Marianne chime in as well.
Please.
We would say that we're very pleased with the strategy, although updating it to reflect COVID is a smart idea. The strategy focuses on building strong beginnings, or ECD, protecting children from abuse, neglect, and other forms of violence, and keeping families together. And those three pillars are incredibly important, all of which make up the efforts that the Thrive Coalition and Catholic Relief Services agree should be the basis for a holistic approach to child development. That is the piece that the Global Child Thrive Act has started with, starting strong beginnings. And we hope that Congress and the administration will build on that going forward.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Menjivar, did you have a comment? If not, I have some more.
I would just add to that it's important then in supporting early childhood development, integrating the different aspects of what makes a successful early childhood development model be taken into account, that as much funding is channeled towards this as a cost-effective investment, and that all programs and strategies also focus on funding research as part of program implementation. So we're all able to learn about what works, how much it costs, under what settings things actually work, so that we can learn and improve our cost efficiency and how we support children and families. Thank you.
Thank you. And then one more question. The Global Child Thrive Act intended to strengthen the role of the Special Advisor for Assistance to Orphans and Vulnerable Children, and to empower this person to lead the charge in implementation of this legislation. What is the relevance of this position, and what do you see as the most important challenges the Special Advisor should tackle? And also, how does the lack of an appointed Special Advisor on children in adversity affect USAID's success in prioritizing this issue?
Thank you, Chairman Castro. I would say it's critically important. Without a formally appointed advisor, they are slightly hamstrung. They're doing a great job. They're starting to work on very important components of the implementation of the law. For example, putting together guidance for mission level staff and implementers, and a toolkit, and they're working closely with implementers and practitioners like us to do that, and we're thrilled with that. But there's a piece of the effort which you and the other leads on the Global Child Thrive Act have already tried to get at, which is there are 11 different agencies and offices tasked with implementing the law and integrating ECD into what they do. And you all sent a letter to Congress at the beginning of the, sorry, not Congress, to those offices and agencies at the beginning of the year, flagging this for them. With the formal appointment of a special advisor, this could start to happen. And he or she could reach out to those other agencies and offices, make the case for the importance of this investment, and really start to build those connections. There are some offices that are already participating well, and there's some that have not in the past. So we really believe that a formal appointment is necessary and critical. Thank you.
Thank you. My time is just about up, so I'm going to yield and keep myself on time. Before I go to Ranking Member Malliotakis for her questions, I would just ask the members, please, for those of you that are on virtually, if you use the grid screen, you can see the 5-minute counter counting down. If you go a little bit over, I won't gavel you right away at 1 second over, but if you go too long, I'll have to ask you to wrap up. So please don't think me rude, but I'm going to try to keep us on time. All right? Ranking Member Malliotakis.
Thank you, Chairman. I would love to start off with, Marianne, and I read your bio, both of you. I mean, I very much respect the work that you're doing. You happen to have some experience specifically doing work in Venezuela and have seen firsthand the deteriorating conditions due to socialism. 94% of Venezuelan population have been driven into poverty. And as I mentioned earlier, this was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. And I read earlier also in another article about the average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in weight. I mean, that just shows you the destruction of a government. I'd like to talk about the corruption also in Venezuela. And I was curious, what kind of monitoring is in place, reporting requirements in place to ensure that the money is actually going to where it's intended to go, to actually get to the children, that's not being taken by a corrupt government. And I would just like, and that goes for Venezuela or any other country that we are supporting.
Thank you for the question. I think it's important and valuable to share, and that it's not just for the case of Venezuela, but absolutely everywhere the IRC works. We have really stringent accountability and monitoring mechanisms imposed as part of our humanitarian work on ourselves and on our partners. All the work that we do in response to the displacement in Venezuela and outside of Venezuela is implemented through non-governmental organizations, local organizations that exist, that are on the ground, that have developed expertise in working with communities, with families and children in the kind of work that I mentioned. We also ensure that our assistance is delivered in a principled humanitarian way, adhering to humanitarian principles, that we are part of international agreements for upholding this with our sister organizations such as other international NGOs. And I also think it's important that despite the context inside Venezuela and in the rest of the region where we assist Venezuelan migrants and refugees, that we bear in mind that those difficulties in the operating environment are not a barrier for us to be able to assist. Just last year, inside Venezuela, 4.9 people in need were reached with some form of assistance as part of the humanitarian response plan. So we ensure that it is delivered, that it reaches the people that need it the most, and that it's done with the highest standards of transparency and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Leila, I appreciate the work that you're doing as well. And it's my understanding that a lot of your programs are funded through the private donations versus taxpayer funds. I would love to hear more about how you're doing that and how you believe that we can maybe perhaps encourage some public-private partnerships or and some of the challenges you may have right now with fundraising considering the pandemic.
Thank you, Member Ranking Member Maliatakis. I appreciate the question. Yes, CRS in the past has implemented our ECD programming with the benefit, and we're very lucky to have this, of private funding. And we used those experiences on the ground to really make the case that it's an effective use of money. For example, for every dollar that we invested in early childhood development integrated into an ongoing program, we saw results that produced a $6 to $7 return on investment. And we really followed studies as well. For example, Nobel Prize winning economist James Heckman has done studies documenting this. And we also take the use of this private funding very, very seriously. And we want to be good stewards of it. And so we decided to use it in this regard because of how impactful it is on the ground, how it multiplies the return on investment for children, but also how it brings together families and communities. It strengthens relationships between parents, and it strengthens the bonds between parents and children. Once you strengthen the family, invest in the family strength, that spills over, of course, to the community and the country at large. And we've seen statistics from the same studies of this Nobel Prize winning economist that when a child is able to have access, when a vulnerable child is able to have access to these types of interventions, he or she is likely to earn 26% more as an adult than she otherwise would, which of course contributes to her country's economy, and it's been shown to reduce deficits as well. So for all these reasons, in addition to the fact it's the right thing to do and builds babies' brains, we decided to invest private funding in this effort. And we just believe that, the United States is such a generous donor, we could just multiply what we're doing on behalf of children with.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired there, but thank you. All right, we have Sarah Jacobs, Vice Chair.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. We know that children are most affected by war, both during and after in the short and long term, and that they represent roughly half the world's population affected by conflict. So I think it's really critical that they're given due attention in our foreign assistance and response to conflicts. And as we can all imagine, it's incredibly difficult to ensure children are reaching their full development potential if they're living in a war or being recruited as a child soldier. So Ms. Menjivar, what has been your experience working with children in conflict-affected environments? And could you describe their unique needs, how it's different from adults in the same environment and from children outside of conflict zones, and how we can connect the GCTA to the specific needs of children in conflict and make sure that the programs are able to track children who have experienced conflict and tailor programming to their particular needs?
Thank you, Representative Jacobs. So the specific needs of children affected by crisis, by conflict, in displacement, in terms of their very young age, they're in the care of, at best, their parents, if not relatives, and sometimes people close to the family but that have no blood relation. They are very subjected and influenced by how adults around them, their coping and resiliency skills, and how they're able to provide support and nurturing. They also, if they're outside of their own country, they're subjected to all sorts of rights or denial of rights based on the legal situation of their parents and how the parents can access services for them. For example, if they fall outside the health system, if they're able to access places in nurseries, if their parents are linked to the informal economy, then in times of pandemic, they're not going to be able to go out in countries where there are lockdowns to earn a meager living just for the day. And that affects what nourishment and what nutrition, what food intake they will be subject to. So in terms of the, what the US government, the administration, and how it can influence others to lead on this, is to be able to provide evidence and support of how cost effective, of how efficient supporting children at these young stages, even those affected by conflict, even those on the move, to thrive and become healthy adults. I think that the biggest contribution can be breaking the chain between the corrosive effects of conflict and later violence and later inability to adjust and insert yourself in a useful manner into society.
Thank you. And Ms. Nimatallah, are there other tools that Congress and USAID should be considering elevating to be able to address the specific needs of these children in conflict in US programming?
Thank you so much for that great question, Congresswoman. Yes, there is more that could be done in the field, in our view, and it's starting to gain some traction, I think, among you and your colleagues, but there is an effort now to highlight the importance of mental health and psychosocial support. What we found in refugee situations is that there's a lot of depression, and when parents are unable to properly, when parents are not doing well mentally, they're unable to properly care for their children. And we have found that that type of psychosocial support, in addition to livelihood opportunities and other opportunities to strengthen the family, it should be a key piece of our humanitarian and emergency work in the field.
Thank you. And I only have a short time, so we may have to answer the question later. But, we know from both my experience working at UNICEF abroad and the domestic policy standpoint that solutions to childhood poverty and childcare and early childhood development needs are, they need to be sustained in the long term, and they have the best outcomes when we're working with the partners who are local and on the ground, and oftentimes the people caring for the kids themselves. So, I think later you can tell me how you're working on empowering local organizations and partners in the design and implementation process of these programs, and how you're working to not only give assistance, but also give empowerment and put these providers in the driver's seat. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Next, we'll go to Representative Ilhan Omar.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, for your leadership on this issue and for your hard work on getting the Global Child Thrive Act passed into law in January. Mr. Nimatallah, Mrs. Nimatallah, I want to begin by asking you about the links between forced migration and childhood trauma. Obviously, this is an issue I am personally very familiar with. What are some of the long-term impacts of children being forced to flee their homes, and how should USAID implement the Global Child Thrive Act in such a way that it mitigates these impacts on migrant children?
Yes, thank you for that excellent question, Congresswoman. When children are forcibly displaced and they face danger, fear, lack of stability, possibly loss of a loved one, it can cause toxic stress, which we know has a very negative impact on brain development, especially if it happens between key windows of development during the human brain. For that reason, it's really important to support parents to be able to provide a buffer, if you will, for those children. And if it's not the parent, the closest caregiver or loved one. The Global Child Thrive Act, as my colleague mentioned, does cover humanitarian emergency programming. And that is the area that has, in my opinion, the farthest to go in terms of this implementation work. But we're all very excited, and with the leadership of you and Congress, Chairman Castro and others, and IRC is also spearheading this effort. We're really making an effort to support the administration to ensure that these families receive the interventions that will help them the most to stay together and to support their children to thrive.
And should we be considering this not just in terms of foreign policy, but also in how we approach children across our border?
I cannot speak to the situation at the border so much, except to say that because Catholic Relief Services works internationally, so except to say that from what we know, it is really best to keep children with their families. Children need their loved ones. Stressors like migration, crisis, violence have a tendency, or HIV or COVID, have a tendency to disintegrate families. That is the worst thing for child development. What needs to happen is we need to invest in programs to keep these children with their loved ones, keep them out of institutions. That is very bad for their development.
I appreciate
And support.
that. Appreciate that. Ms. Menjivar, I wanted to ask about the cycle we see in societies where there is an endemic poverty and violence. It is clear how poverty and violence impacts children's lives, and it's obviously an important goal to alleviate that suffering itself. But I also want to ask about what the long-term impacts are. What happens when a generation of children is victimized by violence and poverty? How does the lack of access to education, nutrition, or security for children today impact a society 20, 50, 100 years from now?
Thank you, Representative Omar. I really welcome your question because that goes to the heart of the discussion today and how the US government can best support thriving, healthy children to become adults. So it's the need to break the linkage between trauma in early childhood development, which changes the architecture of the brain, and then how that sets up children for failure, for disadvantage and marginalization. And through early childhood development, which all children can benefit from, but especially those affected by crisis, by displacement, by emergencies, how through interventions, integrated interventions like early childhood development, we can do a short circuit between that trauma, between those disadvantages, between the effects of poverty and getting children in nurturing environments, with nurturing parenting, with loving parenting, with good nutrition, with health, with a sense of safety, where they can go on to develop their talents. And as they grow up and become successful in education settings, they will then go on to become adults that fully contribute to the societies they live in. This is how we break the cycle of poverty. This is how we break the cycle of violence. And this is how we construe healthy societies that have a place for everybody.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. We now go to Representative Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes.
Terrific. And thank you to those who are here to share their knowledge with us. I want to start by first recognizing a piece of legislation that recently passed, which is a bill of mine called the Global Learning Loss Assessment Act. This is a piece of legislation that hopes to understand, to the chair's point, with 90% or so of the schools in the world shuttered, what was the impact on all of the children of the world in terms of their loss of learning. And this legislation directs USAID to evaluate the impact of the pandemic on basic education programs. And I'll start by first a plea to you here on our panel to help us help you, to advocate for that to happen and be passed as well in the Senate so that we can quantitatively understand the impact of this pandemic. But in the meantime, while we're working to get the Senate to move forward on that, what else can USAID and other organizations be doing now to be able to help education systems recover from the pandemic and deliver quality and inclusive education. And my particular focus is on girls and other marginalized youth. And thank you for your answers in advance.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your leadership on that legislation and many other pieces of legislation. We appreciate that. And yes, education and early learning for little ones is a very key component of early childhood development. And yes, you know, millions of children have been deeply impacted by the COVID pandemic, unfortunately. I'm not sure if you saw a recent report by Their World, but they tried to quantify the fact that nearly 8 out of 10 children across the world's poorest countries lacked access to pre-primary education. And pre-primary is one of the few areas of early childhood development that tends to be measured globally, unlike the 0 to 3-year-olds. So it's dire, and we need to be doing more globally. Although I will say that thanks to folks like you, the United States passed the READ Act a couple of years ago and has started to increase our investment in pre-primaries, which is we as advocates are very thrilled to see.
Thank you, and I will look forward to trying to see if there's anything we can do to follow up further on that. I've spent a lot of time in early childhood development and would love to continue to be helpful in that area here in this position. My next question with my last couple minutes is, yesterday I also introduced the Global Malnutrition Prevention and Treatment Act with my colleagues Chair Meeks and Ranking Member McCall and Rep. Young Kim. This bill aims to advance targeted and evidence-based interventions for prevention and treatment of global malnutrition, and it increases USAID's interagency coordination on nutrition. The Global Child Thrive Law makes significant strides to integrate our approach to child-focused foreign assistance programs. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how the U.S. government can move even further to implement this cross-sectoral or whole child approach to foreign policy, an approach that considers health, education, gender, and protecting and engaging all of the range of aspects of a child's being to support families and schools and communities. How can we make sure that we're helping children across the spectrum reach their potential and make sure that those efforts are integrated with one another?
Thank you. If I may start, and my colleague can complement. I think one of the issues of when you mention how can we support an integrated approach, children is by recognizing children don't exist in isolation. So in order for us to be able to assist young babies and young children, we need to provide support to the families and to the immediate environment surrounding them in a holistic manner, which is as your legislation reflects. It can't be just a single focus intervention, but a comprehensive intervention that takes into account all the stresses, all the issues that can lead to trauma and to short circuits, and how we can minimize and manage those risks to create healthier individuals. And I think that when you mention issues addressing gender inequalities, when you mention nutrition, when you mention issues of health, they can't be understood as separate. They all contribute to thriving children, thriving human beings, thriving communities, and communities freer from violence and social conflict.
Yeah, and if I could conclude by saying this is something I experienced firsthand in the classroom. No amount of help can allow a child to learn chemistry if they're hungry, if their teeth hurt, if they can't see, if their parents don't have a job, if they have mental health issues. And these are all things that need to be thought about holistically and inclusively in order for us to make progress, not just here domestically, but around the world. And I will yield back my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative. We'll go now to Representative Daryl Issa.
Thank you, Chairman. And I apologize for being off screen for a few minutes. The question is probably equally for both of you, and it's sort of the businessman question of, if we look at the dollars that are being spent abroad in early childhood, what studies do I have that show that those dollars spent on the youngest children, and we'll leave nutrition out for a moment, and deal with the rest of the portfolio. What do I have that shows that that has as good a return as the same amount of money spent on a greater audience that we're currently not able to fully serve because of limited resources on other programs? Where do I have that proof that that's the best return?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question, and was one of the key reasons we CRS took this issue on so forcefully. We saw that there have been studies in low-income situations that showed that there's a 13% return on investment per year with early childhood development. It does things like reduces the number of children from dropping out of school. It reduces the number of children from taking part in antisocial behavior. It increases their salaries when they grow up. And it not only does it improve their health strangely and allow them to live longer lives, but those benefits spill over to the next generation as well. So it's ongoing. And that's one of the reasons we took it on.
Well, and I appreciate that. The question is a little bit more nuanced, though. The old rule is, wherever we spend $1 trillion, we know it does some good. Given that we run out of money in sub-Saharan Africa, we run out of money in parts of Asia, you name the place, we run out of money before we run out of people and groups that we would help. So the question really is more nuanced. If that is so valuable, then would we move more resources to that and less resources later in the education process? And if not, then would we try to hit a larger audience? And in in the United States, we've spent decades thinking, okay, if people are malnourished when they early in their development, there are physical and mental problems that we have to cope with. That's a food issue. When we look at education and we look at our own Project Head Start, there have been studies that have consistently shown that those who are involved in it and those who are not involved in it by third grade substantially have similar characteristics academically. Now, with that knowledge, the question really is, how do I allocate those resources? Because at the end of the day, in this administration, the one after that, they will always request more money. Let me rephrase it. They'll request less money than the agencies ask for. They'll request more money often than Congress gives them. But one thing that we can have an effect on, particularly on the Foreign Affairs Committee, is how the appropriators guide priorities. And so that's why I'm asking for, where would I go to find specific evidence that contrast X amount of dollars being spent on the later development? And I think about refugees in Lebanon. We can't educate the 1 million refugees and their children in Lebanon if we have a choice between getting them education that leads to marketable skills versus early childhood. How do we allocate that? What studies would I look at to try to weigh that for future appropriation?
So Representative Isa, thank you for your questions. What I would say on that is that there are several studies that do show sort of the returns on early childhood development. And the reason why, if you only have $100, I think your question is, where do I spend that $100? Because it's not necessarily going to keep growing, the $100. So I would say, since 90% of the brain is developed by the age of 3, and what, the security and the foundations that you can set up for the rest of that person's life before the age of 3, you're going to have returns for the rest of your life, whatever you invest in 0 to 3, 0 to 5 years old. So if you don't want to be investing in prevention of violence in other countries and other societies, including domestically, if you don't want to be spending on prevention of substance abuse, if you don't want to have to spend money on how to prevent gender-based violence and violence against women, if you want to reduce what you have to spend combating crime, investing in early childhood development will provide the bigger returns, because 0 to 3, 0 to 5 years old are the critical stages where you can break that cycle of what's going to come later on for societies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. We'll go now to Representative Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to our wonderful witnesses. Thank you for being with us today. I'm thrilled that we're discussing the Global Child Thrive Act, the importance of early childhood education, and most importantly, how both connect to the well-being and prosperity of our entire global community. You know better than I that research indicates that babies' brains can form more than a million connections every second, connections that are shaped and influenced by good nutrition, by security and safety, and stimulation, all of which are essential to a child's healthy development and integral to the foundation for future success. And that's why we must do our part to incorporate early childhood development strategies into our current programs and partnerships. I'd actually like to return to Representative Jacobs' question that we didn't have time to have answered. And as we know from a domestic policy perspective, any solution to child poverty or child care or other support for early childhood development needs to be designed and sustained for the long term. To have meaningful, you need to have those for meaningful and lasting outcomes, of course. And the partners best positioned to develop and implement those solutions are the local ones, the ones on the ground, who will be there hopefully for years to come. So my question for both of you is, how are your respective organizations empowering local organizations and partners in the design and implementation process of the programs?
Thank you so much for that question, Congressman, and thank you for your strong support for the GCTA and for your staff's ongoing support. We really appreciate it. CRS works very diligently to support partners on the ground. And so, for example, with our early childhood development work, we support Catholic sisters who live in some of the most remote villages in the world. They work with families that don't have electricity or running water, but they live in those communities, so they're trusted, and we build up their technical capacity, and then they just take it from there. For example, in Malawi, the nuns that we have supported now are advocating with their government for their government to expand funding for early childhood development. So we take it very seriously, not only in ECD, but in other areas as well.
Thank you.
So thank you for your question, Representative Phillips. And what I would say is similar to CRS. For the Venezuela response, we work with partners who have good knowledge of the communities that they serve, of the areas where they work, and IRC complements that with methodologies, with standards, with humanitarian delivery models. And through that, we reach bigger numbers, a much bigger scale, with improved sort of quality and increased dignity of care for those that we seek to serve. And so for us, partnering with local organizations is a must in our response. It's about seeking complementarity and having a bigger impact by working together.
Thank you both so much, and I couldn't agree more. With my remaining time, I want to focus on other multilateral institutions like the UN and World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. A lot of the development around the world is, of course, done through those organizations, institutions. So how do we raise awareness about the importance of early childhood development with these organizations? How do we tie this into initiatives like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example?
I'll begin, and I'm sure Marianne has a better answer than I, but yes, absolutely. It's really critical. We're hoping that the administration really reaches out and works with the World Bank, UNICEF, the two biggest leaders in the early childhood development space, but there are others as well. And just leveraging their expertise with what we're currently starting to do with the Global Child Thrive Act, and then encouraging partner countries to also invest and integrate ECD into what they're doing. Over to Marianne.
Thank you. I would complement what my colleague just said, leading by example. That's what I would advocate for. To the extent that the US administration leads by example, it will pull other donors, multilateral agencies, partner governments, and it sets the tone and a message that early childhood development is important, that you need to invest in this, that we need to prioritize it, and that this is a winning strategy for setting up whole societies for success in a different way to what we've known now.
Well, thank you both for your advocacy, and clearly we have a lot of work to do both around the world and frankly right here in the United States as it relates to investing in children. So thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Phillips, and that concludes our questions for our witnesses today. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us at this subcommittee hearing. As we've heard from our witnesses, the United States government and our partners must strengthen our international leadership on early childhood development at this critical time. The Congress took a strong first step, passing the Global Child Thrive Act. And with your input today, we will be better equipped to ensure successful implementation. So thank you all, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.